Local 514 sat down with activist Ellen Gabriel to discuss the House of Commons motion to recognize the crisis of missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two Spirits, and trans folks as a national emergency. Gabriel discussed what should be done on a provincial and federal level to prevent ongoing cases of missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two Spirit, and trans folks in Canada.
So recently, the House of Commons passed a motion wanting to declare the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls a national emergency, as well as set up a red dress alert system. Could you just tell me some of your reactions and thoughts to this?
Yeah, I think that motion was put forth by Leah Gazan, the MP from Winnipeg, and she's been working on this issue for a long time, so she knows the needs of the families and understands in depth the issues. And I think it's about time that the government has a red dress alert. It's an issue that the governments, all level of governments, including the authorities, have not taken seriously. They just, they talk a lot, but there's no specific understanding of what the issues are, the fact that Indigenous women are being targeted by not just serial killers, but just in general. And so the issue of racism needs to be addressed, and I think it's a brilliant idea.
Thank you so much. What do you think of the Canadian government's implementation or lack of implementation of many calls to action from various reports over the years?
Yeah, I think that part of that is there's always this rule in law, especially in the Canadian Constitution, that Canada has to uphold the honor of the Crown. So whatever that means, the word honor is in there. And I don't think they have been honoring nor respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. I think they try to placate Indigenous people by creating these expensive commissions in which they have the final say over. And I think that the government is not really serious about all these issues because there's so many, it's centuries. It's not just like an issue that happened 10 years ago or whatever. It's a centuries old issue of racism and genocide. And so I think that what happens at the end of the day, the Treasury Board is actually the ones who do stuff. So, and it's expensive to, change the way society thinks about Indigenous people. And so I always think about what motivates governments and their entities is the bottom line. And that's exactly what we've been facing, because Stolen Sisters came out in 2004. That's almost 20 years ago. The Royal Commission came out in 1996, 95. So there's a lot of reports and a lot of explanations of what needs to be done. The recommendations, I think, just fall on deaf ears and stay on shelves. And it's Indigenous people actually that are actually saying, you have not respected these calls to action. It's only when we bring it up that they actually do something, or Indigenous MPs. So I think that there is a lack of trust because of the way the government handles their accountability in creating problems that are impacting Indigenous peoples today, whether they be historically or their dysfunctional forms of the Band Council and Indian Act.
Is there anything that you would like to say on the provincial or municipal level of either, calls to action that you think are absolutely, how do I say this? Maybe an absolute necessity to focus on right at this moment, or just anything that you're not seeing that you would like to see on either level of government?
Well, the provincial government, at least in where I'm staying, which is Quebec, they do not recognize there's any problem of systemic racism. So that in itself is a statement of racism. they don't take our issues easily. They like to label us as Quebecois or just like all the other Quebecois, but we're not. I'm not Quebecois. I'm Kanien'kehá:ka, and that's there's no way that the premier can impose that label on us. So it's to them it's all about the French language. They're not concerned about Indigenous women. There was the report. Oh my God, I can't remember the report. But when the 38 women from Val d'Or were sexually assaulted by SQ officers, the commission came out, the Vienne Commission, and it talked about what needed to be done, but they ignored that as well. So they're really not interested in addressing the issues unless their constituents feel it's important. So, we need to work with society at large to try and work together to create the changes that we need to make Indigenous women safe. And when I worked with Quebec Native women, my team was working with new recruits of the Sûreté du Québec. I don't think they're doing that anymore. I don't think it made an impact. I think a lot of them felt like, oh, I have to go to this. And so they go, right? So there's not much interest in learning about us. So this is where I think at the educational level, the curriculum level, that Canada's genocidal history, along with the provinces who participated and are partners in this genocide, need to tell the history. They need to tell the truth, and they're not doing it. They're not. They're just. I think the provinces see us as a burden. They see us as disposable and invisible people, unless we say, okay, we're here. We're not ghosts of the past. We're actually living human beings, and our cultures evolve. So I think that they're equally accountable as the federal government is to work with Indigenous people, not the Indigenous organizations per se, but to bring it into the communities, to have community members talk about it, because we're so busy trying to survive. As communities, we have so many problems that are rooted in the impacts of colonization. To address this issue of safety is a real challenge. So the provinces need to at least educate their constituents, and Indigenous people. We need to stand together on this issue, because it is it is a serious issue that is not being handled properly by any entity.
Over the years I've lived in Montreal, I've seen you at the annual Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's March, and I'm just curious, especially since the National Inquiry came out and other responses or anything from the government, have you seen changes in these protests, whether it's from non-Indigenous participation, politicians coming, anything like this?
Well, I mean, when we first started them, there was 8 people in Montreal. There was 8 of us, and it grew into hundreds and hundreds of people now. I think more people know about the issue, and they come to these demonstrations, which is extremely important to show numbers and people care. I think the challenge is to get people involved and not just expect government to provide the solutions, right? So the issue itself has gotten worse, I think, because the ones who are really on the front lines are the police, and there are community members out on the streets trying to help Indigenous women and homeless people. But, like in any society that wants to make changes, people need to become involved. And so hopefully, people will realize that if they call upon the government to do something and support Indigenous-led initiatives, then that will greatly help the solutions that we're looking for. But this serial killer that dumped women into the landfill in Winnipeg, This guy should have been taken out of the country. It would not resolve the problem though, because he would be living where he's from and probably killing women there. But there's statistics that say 1 in 3 people in Canada living in Canada have mental health problems. And so I know they're trying to make it people more aware, but there is so much stress in society, in a capitalist society that professes to be a democratic society, that I think that these two things just don't work well together. So people are stressed or grow up in situations that shouldn't happen for children and then grow up to be adults. I'm not an expert. I just know a little bit about um, uh, what kind of monsters are created that do these kinds of heinous acts against a human being. So we need to look more than just mitigation. We need to look at what's taught in the schools, and that parents need to become more involved, because I think a lot of parents, I won't say all of them, but there seems to be quite a lot of parents that expect their child, the school, to help the child with their moral values or stuff like that. Um, spending time with children, and it's difficult when you're a single parent. It's difficult in many situations. We can't single out one, but it starts in the home. It starts in schools. It starts in what are the norms in society that are acceptable. And right now it's acceptable to criminalize Indigenous people, to which gives the impression to society, especially those who do have strong mental illnesses, that Indigenous people are disposable and expendable. So it's an interrelated, interconnected issue. It's not just about violence. It's about how we get there. It's like, how did this start to get to where we are today, and how we need to move forward. And I think that's where that's lacking. They're just totally looking at their so-called rule of law, and rebranding the RCMP, which is ridiculous. Their history continues to this day, whether or not they rebrand themselves. And so there's a lot of work to be done. It's not just on the shoulders of politicians. It's and the bureaucrats who control the politicians. There's a cultural, there's a bureaucratic culture that exists in all levels of government, who are the gatekeepers, and they're the ones pushing back against the rights of the human rights of Indigenous women and peoples. So there's so many hands that are creating the dysfunction that we see today.
Earlier this month, at a press conference, you said that it becomes a matter of economics. It goes to the Treasury Board rather than looking at education of leaders, politicians, what human rights actually means. Would you be willing to elaborate on this a little bit?
I think I just answered your question, though. I did. I mean, a lot of politicians go in, they don't even know about human rights. They don't even understand. Like, they probably never read the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. They probably never read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They probably never even read the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. All those things would help guide them in the decisions that they're making, instead of going by what their constituents want. Because there are people who want to get into politics that are only too willing to promote the agenda of a very conservative and those who are against human rights or the freedoms that have been fought for so many decades, to get equal rights for women. Now we have Indigenous rights that are being implemented in Parliament, but they're not respected. Right? It's like, how much is this going to cost us? And it's kind of like, well, how much to you is a human life worth? And I think that's where there's a flaw in how this thing has been handled. You can throw a lot of money at Indigenous women's organizations or the Assembly of First Nations or other Indigenous organizations to work on the problem, but at the end of the day, it's the government that makes the decisions. And they can tick the box to say, yeah, we consulted Indigenous partners on these issues, but they still won't do anything. So a lot of time and energy goes into consulting Indigenous peoples by those organizations. But if government doesn't like those recommendations, they won't implement it. If we were to say today, yeah, you can have all our land, we're going to get rid of the reserve system, take all our rights away, and continue to practice colonial genocide against Indigenous people. If we were to say that tomorrow, they would be really happy. Because then it would resolve their problem. An apology does not resolve the problem. Monetary compensation does not address the problem. It doesn't take away the hurt. What really needs to happen is a mind change, positive mind change, as we say in our language, have a good mind. And I don't see that in Parliament. I don't see that in anything that I've witnessed, whether it's provincial or federal.
Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like to share?
I think so.
Okay. Thank you once again. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Ellen.
Thank you, Savannah. And just let me know when it's going to be, when you have finished your article.
Of course, I'll send it to you. Thank you so much again. Have a lovely day, all right?
You too. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.